in the Global South, the Formation of Political Capabilities in Higher Education by Kurauone Masungo. I'm just going to start off by reminding everybody to please keep your mics on mute and only unmute them when it is your turn to speak. The discussants are welcome to have their videos on, and I will be asking them to do so at least when they are speaking. We will start off the program with authors' reflections, followed by commentary from the three discussants, and then we'll have some time towards the end for Q&A before we give our thanks to everyone and close off the session, at least to the people online, because we'll then be meeting to celebrate and have lunch together here at Benito Kotseng at the University of the Free State. So I'm going to start off by introducing you to our three discussants, and they are Professor Rachel Brooks, who is a professor of higher education in the Department of Education at the University of Oxford, having recently moved to Oxford from the University of Surrey, where she held a variety of management roles, including head of department and associate dean for research, and she was principal investigator for the university's ESRC-funded Impact Acceleration Account. She is the current president of the British Sociological Association, and her research focuses primarily on the sociology of higher education. Particular areas of expertise include international student mobility, including processes of internationalization and Europeanization in higher education more generally. She's also interested in student politics and protest and ensuring equity in access to and outcomes within higher education. Our second discussant will be Professor Thierry Lucia. Thierry is the strategic lead for research on equitable education in the Human Sciences Research Council in Cape Town, South Africa. He is a adjunct professor at Nelson Mandela University and a research fellow here at the University of the Free State. He researches, supervises, and publishes on higher education development, higher education policy, the student experience of higher education, student politics, and student affairs in Africa. His current work includes research on the state of transformation in public universities in South Africa for the South African Transformation Oversight Committee, research into the student movement and Fees Must Fall, funded by the National Research Foundation and the Mellon Foundation, and research on reimaginations of the future of the African University, which is funded by the MasterCard Foundation. Our third discussant for today will be Professor Elaine Unterhalter, who is a professor of education and international development at University College London, IOE, Education, Practice and Society. Elaine works on themes concerned with gender, race, and class inequalities and their bearing on education. Her specialist interests are in the capability approach and human development in a number of countries in Africa, including Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, and a particular focus and interest in South Africa. Her current concerns are with education, poverty, addressing intersectional inequalities in global social justice, and she has been working on questions concerning indicators and the analysis of data to support international, national, and local initiatives for change. I would just like to take this moment to thank our discussants for agreeing to be discussants for this launch. And I can hear a slight echo, so if anyone has by mistake left their mics unmuted, please make sure that you mute your microphone. Thank you. So we look very much forward to hearing from the discussants on their thoughts, their reflections, and their general commentary on the book. But before we hear from our discussants, we will first hear from the author who is sitting beside me, and that is Dr. Kurauone Masungo. He holds a Master of Science in Media and Society Studies from Midland State University in Zimbabwe, and a PhD in Development Studies from the University of the Free State. Kura joined the Higher Education and Human Development Research Program in 2019, I think.
2020.
2020, yeah. as a PhD fellow and graduated 3 years later and became a postdoctoral fellow in the same year that he graduated. His research interests are in higher education, student well-being, and agency. Kura's work explores, using the capability approach, students' perspectives and experiences for an account of the potential of student activism in the enhancement of student well-being and agency through the formation of political capabilities and functionings for justice. He has been involved in a range of research projects, and I think his forthcoming publications in different ways respond to young people's demands for improving their skills in indigenous forms of art and embedding cultural heritage into their artistic practice and skills for wider recognition and public engagement. Kura is also the coordinator for the HTCA Southern Africa Regional Network, and of course, a valued member of SARChI-HEHD. Kura, I will now hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mika, for the introduction. I would like to thank Mika Teko and Lucretia for the work that they put in organizing the book launch. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to the discussants, the three discussants, that is Elaine, Rachel, and Thierry, who agreed and availed themselves to offer their reflections on the book that I will be presenting to you today. And then I would also like to extend my appreciation to all of you, both who are online and those who are in this room, for attending and being part of the group. So the idea of the book that I'll be launching today are from my PhD research that I conducted at the University of the Free State between 2020 and 2022. So my research was looking at the development of higher education students' political capabilities through activism, through student activism. And the idea of the book was to consider the possibility of promoting justice and democracy in the higher education space through the formation of and expansion of students' political freedoms. And I drew on student voices to investigate, as well as to evaluate the extent to which there is justice in higher education. So in the book, I made use of the capability approach lens, or I applied the capability approach to conceptualize and to analyze data from interviews that I conducted with the students. I had three categories of students that I interviewed. The first category comprised of members of the student governing body, that is the SRC, and the second category comprised of activist organizers, that is those who are responsible for initiating and organizing activism activities, both online and face-to-face. And then I also had the student participants who are part of the third category, who are those students who participated in activism activities organized by the SRC or by the student by the activist organizers. So my use of the capability approach allowed me to conceptualize and analyze data from the interviews, as well as to contextualize and theorize student activism and how their participation in activism in the pursuit of what they value under the then present conditions of possibilities. And then my interest in focusing on activism in South Africa specifically, I looked at how the student activism, or how the higher education landscape in South Africa was characterized by student activism, which became prominent in the past decade with protests such as the Fees Must Fall, the Roads Must Fall, Station Must Fall, and language protests as well, which have been noted and argued to have produced positive results in some instances. For example, where we have got universities initiating transformational processes, the introduction of NSFAS and all that stuff. So in the book, I demonstrate how student activism can contribute to the formation of political freedoms in transformative way for the students, the university, and society by extension. And just a broad overview of the book. The book has got 7 chapters, and in the first chapter, which is titled Justice and Democracy in Higher Education in Overview, I present debates and on justice and democracy in higher education, which is a subject that has been recorded in a broad body of scholarship. In that chapter, I also define student activism, and I offer a descriptive overview of student activism from the 1960s, protests against segregation, the Vietnam War in the global north, and then I also progressed to give an overview, a descriptive overview of student activism in the global south on against colonialism, neoliberalism, and the fight for democracy. And then in the second chapter, I contextualize student activism in South African higher education and in relation to the situation prevailing at the time and policies implemented, as well as students' reaction to the situation prevailing and the policies that were introduced and implemented. And then in chapter 3, I focus on the capability approach and why the capability approach is a powerful framework per se, as it allowed me to question and illustrate complex characteristics of student activism. Chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 are empirical chapters which present a descriptive and analytical account of the SRC, activist organizers, and student participants' views and perspectives on student activism as efforts to promote or intervene in social, political, economic, or environmental reforms with a desire to achieve transformational change. And in these chapters, that is chapter 3, chapter 4, 5, and 6, I highlight how students who get involved in activism bring with them a history of involvement in struggles at school, commitments and concerns for social justice, which drives their activism. And the chapters also capture conversion factors and processes that enabled or constrained student activism experiences. And then in chapter 7, I bring together chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 to theorize capabilities and student activism. I discuss how and why the book conceptualizes student activism as a space for forming valuable political functionings that promote student well-being. So what I want to do now is to focus on how the capability approach was useful in interpreting issues of justice in the context of student activism. So through the lenses of the capability approach, I was able to evaluate and analyze student lives through exploring freedoms and opportunities that students value. And by freedoms and opportunities that freedom value, I also included those opportunities and freedoms that they have and those that they do not have but value. And then in the book, I draw on Sen's idea of political freedoms, which relate to opportunities that allow people to determine who should govern them. And beyond that, I also considered freedoms to express political ideas, dissent, and critique, as suggested by Sen. And then narrowing down the capability approach, I then focus on Melis Chin's conception or idea of political capabilities, which are related to one's freedom to express political ideas and to engage in politics. That is, students' ability to join protests or act as political or social activists. And through political capabilities, as suggested by Chin, we are able to look at how political freedoms and how political opportunities disrupt dehumanizing narratives of disadvantaged and underrepresented groups in society by creating a space for political advocacy for a better life or transformational change. Again, the capability approach language allowed me to consider the intersectionality of conversion factors and process and how they weighed to enable or to constrain students' participation in various activism initiatives. again, I also considered the role of agency in student activism to look at how and what motivated students making decisions to join activism. Secondly, students giving reasons as to why they get involved in activism. And thirdly, as well as consider students and collective resistance bringing about transformational change within the university space. So after I have analyzed the data from the interviews that I conducted with the students, I then extrapolated capabilities and their corresponding functionings, which I present in the slide here. So on the left panel, we have got a list of the capabilities, the political capabilities list, and on the right panel, we have got their corresponding functionings or practical expression. So the first capability, that is the capability to participate, which I define as the freedoms or the ability to access and be involved in fair process to include what students wish for, and which is expressed through in-person participation in protest actions, as well as online participation through sharing, retweeting, and commenting on specific hashtags that will be trending. And then the second capability is the capability for public deliberation and dialogue, which I define as the ability to interact, agree, and disagree, as well as to reach a consensus with university management and with students. And then its practical expression is students being able to initiate and engage in public debates for a mutual outcome. And then on the capability for voice, we are referring to the ability to express, the ability of students to express their opinions and make them count during the process of deliberation. And its corresponding functioning is the students raising their concerns, being listened to, and having their contribution taken into account when they interact or when they engage in conversations with university management and even amongst themselves as students. And then we also have got the emotional expression capability, which is being able to control their emotions and not being subjected to anxiety and fear, which might negatively affect their participation in activism. And its corresponding functioning is students being able to deal with the disappointments, fear, and anxiety associated with participation in activism, and being able to balance activism obligation with academic work. And then we also have got the capability for physical well-being, which I define as the ability or the opportunity for safety and freedom from all forms of physical and verbal harassment when they engage in different forms of activities or activism activities. And its practical expression is being able to participate in protests without risk of physical harm or ill-being. And then we also have got the capability for practical reasoning, which are the opportunities to form a conception of what is good for the students amongst themselves, and to engage in critical reflections about the planning of their life. And then its corresponding functioning was students being able to critically reflect on their conception of what is good and being able to make reasoned decisions. And then the last capability is that of contextual knowledge formation, which is having access to ideas and knowledge that shape and influence student experiences. And its corresponding functioning is students sharing information in small groups amongst themselves, informing and educating each other on issues that give context to their experience. So in the book, I also consider the intersectionality of conversion factors, which worked to enable or to constrain the formation of political capabilities for student activism. And in this slide, I outline the different conversion factors, and amongst the conversion factors, we have got enabling conversion factors as well as constraining conversion factors. And under enabling conversion factors, We have got social media, which acted as an information sharing tool. We also have got students also identified lawyers who provided legal representation and legal counsel. And then students also identified political parties as an enabling conversion factor, and then the business community. And then for constraining factors, that is those factors that acted as a barrier in students' initiatives, activism initiative, there is social media, which and it's as an ambiguous space. There is also the SRC one-year term, which was mainly identified by members of the student governing body. We also have got a political party affiliation, which both students and activist organizers identified as constraining their participation in activism. And then we also have got unfair university responses, which students from all the three categories identified, and they mainly mentioned issues of disciplinary hearings, suspensions, court interdicts, arrests, tear gassing, private security beatings, among the different conversion factors that they identified. So broadly across all student groups, social media played an important role as an enabling information sharing tool. And from that, I got to learn that the information availability cannot be taken for granted, given that they mentioned that we rely on social media before, during, and even after protest actions to access information. And whilst social media was identified as an enabling conversion factor, it was also mentioned and identified as a barrier due to its ambiguous nature and its potential to be a toxic space as well. And in demonstrating the intersectionality of these various conversion factors and processes that either enabled or constrained student pursuit of transformational change, I also focused on how the SRC identified political party affiliation as an enabling factor, and they identified their one-year term a limit as a barrier, and at the same time, activist organizers identified political party affiliation as a barrier to their activism activities. Mainly for the activist organizers, their view was that engaging in activism as a person or as an individual who's not affiliated to any political party or who's affiliated to any political party has got its own drawbacks, because students, whenever you present an idea, students would ask you, whose idea are you representing? And in some cases, those students may not be interested in what in a specific political party. So those are some of the dynamics that emerged when I was writing the book and the thesis during the writing of the research. And then to conclude, I propose the expansion of the political capabilities I mentioned earlier as enhancing the development of a meta capability to transform, which might not be a fully realized functioning, except in those instances where there is success. For example, when you look at the Fees Must Fall, which actually saw students from low-income backgrounds having access to university. And so these capability intersects, as these capabilities intersect and reinforce each other, and they reinforce their formation, I now tend to look at how their formation enhances the formation of the meta capability to transform. And this meta capability to transform also depends on individual students exercising their agency, which also translated to collective agency demonstrated when students came together to participate in collective action. And most importantly, the political capabilities I identified and the meta capability to transform are fundamentally collective capabilities. That is, I look at opportunities obtained through interaction in and within a group in the process of activism. So through the process of activism, students' individual agents translated to collective agency for collective action, in which students were able to realize the capacity for voice in group dialogue, engage in dialogue, and participate equally in protest actions, share knowledge, value physical well-being, as well as a capability for public reasoning. And then by coming together, the students as a collective to agitate for change, for transformational change, students demonstrated the value of group and collective resistance. And what is more important now is how the students, through transcending their political differences, showed a high level of awareness of how they are embedded in a network of social relationships that they can use or that they can utilize to achieve access to higher education and enhanced well-being. Again, I propose higher education as a transformative democratic space that is facilitated through promoting freedoms that enable students to engage in dialogue and deliberate on political problems associated with the university space. And then for all this to be achieved, there has to be conditions of possibilities for transformational change, which need to be in place for student activism to move in the direction of present and future-facing change. And this condition of possibilities, firstly, it's the condition of participatory parity, which is actually in the, if you look at the diagram in front of you, those cogs, we've got the participatory parity, which is all students having equal voice in when they engage in deliberation or when they engage in dialogues. The second condition of possibility is epistemic contribution, that is all students being recognized and respected as knowers and as tellers. And thirdly, the condition for transformation, that is democracy and equality. And with that, I conclude that student activism of any kind is a space which offers students an opportunity to exercise the capability for voice given the necessary conditions. And speaking of the necessary conditions, I would like to extend my appreciation and gratitude to Melan, who was my supervisor, and Fenella, who was my co-supervisor, for allowing me or for offering me the space to develop the ideas that I have captured in the book. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to the discussants and the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group for the informal conversations that we had, and the students themselves who availed themselves and who participated in the interviews. And I would also like to appreciate, I saw my former lecturer, Dr. Mary Piri, and my former undergraduate supervisor, Dr. Lighton Ngube. And thank you so much. Thank you, Mika.
Thank you, Kura, for that very insightful and detailed sort of overview of your book. Congratulations on this wonderful achievement. I'd now like to call on Professor Rachel Brooks to give her commentary, followed by Thierry and then Elaine. The floor is yours, Rachel.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I should start by saying thank you very much for inviting me to be a discussant today and for sending me a copy of the book. I really enjoyed reading it. So in my brief comments today, I just wanted to start off with a few sort of quite general reflections that I came to when I was reading the book, and then perhaps move on to three specific issues that I thought I'd raise as a discussant that are more sort of, I suppose, based around questions and that might feed into the kind of wider discussion at the end. So some general reflections to start with. Firstly, I thought this was a really kind of clearly written, clearly structured, clearly signposted book. So many congratulations on putting such a polished piece of work together. I suppose one of the things that I really liked was the focus on political capabilities. And I thought this was quite an innovative kind of theoretical perspective to bring to work on student politics, and something that I hadn't, read too much about, the two areas being, well, that kind of theoretical framework being applied to student politics and protest. So I thought that was innovative and a really interesting way, I suppose, of exploring the way in which capabilities are formed through these kind of actions on university campuses. So that was really a strength of the book to me, and something that I took away from it that was quite important. I suppose the second general reflection is the focus on the university as a kind of transformative democratic space for developing these students' political capabilities. And I think that came through really strongly in the kind of key arguments of the book, but also in a lot of the empirical data. And that seems to me a really important argument to make. I mean, certainly in the UK over recent years, university campuses have come under a lot of criticism from a lot of different social actors. And I think underlining their importance for that kind of transformative work is really important. I think it's a really important counterpoint to arguments about universities just preparing students for the labour market and, their kind of a function in a knowledge economy. So I think that kind of wider sense of what university campuses can bring in contemporary society was really important. And although a different kind of geographical space, I've recently kind of completed quite a large cross-national European project, and that was certainly one of the messages that was coming out from the students of universities as these spaces for developing civic orientations, but also the specific skills to allow people to intervene in the public sphere and in public debate. And the students themselves feeling that often wasn't recognised by policymakers, by the media, even by some higher education staff. And I suppose there was quite a strong resonance between the arguments that you were making in this book and my own work, which has kind of, sought to juxtapose student perspectives like that with some of the ones that we hear more commonly from policy that construct the purpose of the university in much narrower terms. So I thought that was a really important argument that you make on the basis of your data. The third general reflection, I suppose, was I really liked your focus on different groups of students, because often in the work on student politics, we hear from either activists or student representatives or kind of general students. And I thought one of the really nice things about your research is that you bring together data from these three different groups of students. And as a result of doing that, can kind of tease out similarities and differences in their perspectives, in their activities and their actions. And I think that kind of diversity is often quite rare in the studies of student politics, and is certainly a strength of your work. And then I suppose linked to that was the really sensitive way in which you use data from your participants. The book is the empirical chapters are a great read, because there are so many kind of really vivid quotations from your participants that bring to life the kind of I suppose more analytical and more theoretical points that you're making. So I really enjoyed that kind of diversity of student voice. And then I thought fourthly, and a fourth sort of general point, but maybe also links into some of the kind of specific questions I'm going to raise in just a second. I thought your kind of critique of the role of social media in student politics was also quite interesting, and quite an interesting counterpoint to some kind of literature over the past 10 or 20 years that has argued that social media or new technologies have had a kind of fundamental focus in reconfiguring the way in which student politics is now done. So that's obviously come from from Africa in terms of Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall that you talked about, but also I suppose in relation to kind of literature from Europe as well. I'm thinking about some British literature, but also I think Greet Nielsen is in the audience, and I just a couple of weeks ago heard a really interesting paper from her, and her argument is that social media is a kind of really important part of the kind of everyday activism that she argues students are now engaged in. So I thought actually your arguments about social media were quite important in playing into that broader context. So that's some general reflections. And then I suppose there are three sets of questions that I want to raise. These aren't all for you to answer by any means, but I suppose there were things that I was thinking about as I was reading the book, and things that may be useful to pick up in the wider discussion afterwards. So I suppose the first is about your focus on the social media, and perhaps in your presentation I thought you perhaps downplayed it a little bit, because then when you set up your research questions, actually 3 out of the 5 of them do have a really strong focus on social media. And I suppose what I took away from the book is that perhaps, in relation to this particular group of people, social media wasn't as important as perhaps we might expect. So just a few questions around this, really. I just wondered to what extent you had I felt there was a sort of, a tendency in parts of the book to set up this dichotomy between social media use on one hand and face-to-face activism on the other. And I just wondered whether it could be looked at kind of more holistically. There's been some quite interesting work which has been done on sort of, I suppose, how students learn, so like pedagogy in the classroom, which has argued that, you know, actually we shouldn't see kind of digital technologies on one hand and more analog methods on the other. Actually, students just combine the two all the time in quite kind of innovative ways. And I was just wondering whether that might provide another way to look at kind of social media and face-to-face political activity in relation to students. And I suppose linked to that was kind of broader questions about whether you see the two, whether you see them as kind of qualitatively different, whether you think there are certain affordances that social media offer that face-to-face activism doesn't, or vice versa. Does social media lead to a qualitatively different type of politics and protest? And if so, what is the nature of that? So I felt that perhaps could be kind of, you know, teased out a little bit more to extend that discussion of what the role of social media is here. And I suppose, you know, are they just kind of conceived as kind of different tools that a student activist or a student representative can use, or actually do they lead to different types of engagement? And just going back to Greet's work that I mentioned, I think that, well, she says that she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of her argument is that the kind of everyday use of memes and other types of social media affordances can lead to a very different type of student activism than we've seen in the past, a more kind of less public one, more private, and a more kind of everyday form. So it'd be interesting to hear your views on that. And I was wondering about kind of, you know, what other forms of new technology. There's a big focus on social media, and brief mention I think is made once in the book or twice about kind of Zoom. But are other forms of new technology important and here, and how do they feed into these discussions? And do students you know, have any concerns about their use of social media? I didn't really feel this was discussed very much, but certainly in the UK there are concerns about, you know, surveillance, universities monitoring social media that students might use, and does that play into this kind of, you know, the arguments that are made about some students, you know, kind of seeing social media and its contributions as quite limited. So that's the first area of questioning, really. Some issues around kind of social media and how you're kind of conceptualizing that. The second set of questions is around sort of student activism more generally. And one of the really nice things I felt about the book is that it takes a very positive tone. It's all about kind of, you know, these actions, these activities leading to the development of political capabilities. But just, I suppose, situating this within the broader literature on student politics and protest, I wondered if there are kind of any negative aspects to it that, you know, that people spoke to you about that you didn't decide to include in the book, or whether actually that was genuinely absent. And I suppose I'm thinking here of comparisons with some work that the political scientist Sylvia Nissen has done in New Zealand, where she talks about how for many students there are lots of downsides these days of engaging in student political activity. For example, feeling that, you know, that it might be seen quite negatively by employers, and students being worried about kind of, you know, their entry into the labour market. So I just wondered if there are kind of any negative aspects about becoming involved in politics and protest in your case study. And I suppose a kind of a similar one really is whether I suppose the focus on campus issues. So that came through quite strongly, and I suppose the impression that I got from the book was that the focus on campus issues went alongside a focus on wider societal issues, and the two actually kind of, you know, fitted together quite well. But I suppose in Britain and some other countries of the global north, that the argument is often made that students who focus on campus issues often do so or the consequence of that is that they kind of, you know, don't have the time, the inclination, the resources to focus on wider societal issues. So I just wondered whether there's any tension between the kind of strong campus focus that was evident in your study and those and wider issues that students may or may not want to protest about, and the kind of relationship between those two, whether it's kind of more intertwined than we see in some other geographical contexts. I suppose I was also, in terms of kind of, thinking about activism more generally, I was interested in the third group of student respondents. You had the ordinary student participants who'd taken part in the activism. And I suppose I didn't really get a sense of the size of that community. Is it a kind of relatively small one, or is it something that, actually, because these student representatives, the student activists are so kind of, active on the campus, it involves a large group of these kind of more ordinary students? Because I think certainly in other countries, the argument has been made that, it's actually only a relatively small proportion of students who become involved in these activities and therefore have I suppose, the opportunity to develop the political capabilities that you've been talking about. So I guess some kind of size of that community would be useful to know. And then finally, I suppose, in relation to activism more generally, I was wondering about the social characteristics of the students. We're told quite a lot about the institutional characteristics, the institutional space in which they're operating. But, kind of what are the backgrounds of these individuals, and do their backgrounds have an impact on the action they take and the way in which they go about taking that action? So who becomes involved in these in the representation and the activism, and how relevant are their aspects of their social background, for example, their previous life experiences, the time they have available to become involved in such activity, and the confidence they have to take action. So some questions around kind of the backgrounds of the individuals that you talked about. And then finally, just a few questions about geographical reach. So the title of the book, as you told us, is Student Activism in the Global South. But I suppose all of your data comes from the South African context. And so I was just wondering about the extent to which you felt that your findings are generalizable to other national contexts in Africa, in the Global South, more broadly. Or whether actually there are, I suppose, there are idiosyncrasies that either to do with the South Africa or the particular campus that you were conducting your research that actually kind of limits those kind of learnings across institutional and national borders. So that's just a few thoughts from me, some questions, not all of which I expect you to answer by any means. But just to say again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today and giving me the opportunity to read the book, which I really enjoyed. So thank you.
Is it just me, or can we not hear online what's going on in the room?
Is that better?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
You didn't hear me thanking Rachel for a wonderful set of questions and reflections on the book. And then I said I was going to move swiftly along and ask you, Thierry, to go next, please.
Okay, well then, let me get started. First of all, thank you, Kura and Mikateko, for your invitation. And wonderful to be here. And thanks as well to, of course, Melanie, and then also Rachel and Elaine and everybody who's here. I have thoroughly enjoyed the book. Kura, I am very much excited actually about the work that you have been doing. I think, and as I hear Rachel feels the same, that the application of the capabilities approach to the particular instance of student activism as a way to study and try and understand the development of student political capabilities through participation in student activism is really exciting. It's fresh, it's a new way of looking at it, and as I will note in my few comments, has actually quite a lot of implications, very positive implications. So I really find that a very fresh perspective. And with that, of course, I mean, oftentimes in studies of student engagement, for example, where one looks at student political involvement as well, to some extent, one relates it to learning and to academic success of students, you know, or in my work, oftentimes student activism has been looked at in terms of to what extent can it contribute to changing the university itself, to changing governance processes and so on, you know. But this is a different take on it, and more especially what I'm most excited about is, of course, because it, as you show, you know, especially in your chapter 3, I loved your chapter 3, by the way. I felt for the first time that I had a beautiful inroad into the capabilities approach that talked to me all the way, because I'm doing student activism research as well, right? And I was all the time waiting for it, like, yes, tell me, how are you going to apply this? Oh, this is wonderful. And the way you were able to like hold so many balls in there, I was really found it very exciting. So the ability to now link that to the human development, you know, to human freedom, to social justice in a much broader frame, I found that very, very exciting. Probably like Rachel, I was at times, I was a bit surprised about your optimism for the university as this transformative space. I've just come from my third installment of the conference, the annual conference Advancing Critical University Studies in Africa, where it often feels not very much an optimistic conversation around what is the emancipatory potential of the university these days in a techno-rational world. And, you know, in the context of managerialism and whatever else, you have it, neoliberal policies. So, the chapters 4, 5, 6, the empirical richness is really beautiful. I love the way you are grounding your work empirically and show how you arrive eventually at table 7 in the conclusion that kind of pulls it all together with the capabilities and the functionings all beautifully listed up. I'm not going to comment much more on social media. I think Rachel has basically discussed that very well already. I think it shows probably in the post 2015-16 era that kind of also the optimism around the potential of this digitally networked movements that emerged with Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, that kind of has taken a more settled and perhaps less digital media, a less central role. Still, of course, for informing and mobilizing students, but perhaps not exactly as much in such an optimistic way as like Castells at the time started to explain it and so on. Good. So I also have a few questions, and I don't expect you at all in this probably a bit of a high stress situation for you. I hope not. I mean, we're all friendly. We're all very excited about your work. So please don't get all nervous about it. But just to say a few things, like I actually thought again and again, of course, yours is a study of student activism, but you also looking at SRCs, and you also occasionally talk about you know, participation in structures and relations with management and so on. And I was thinking myself, like, I wasn't interested originally when I started doing work on student politics in activism at all. I wasn't interested in protesting and so on as something to study. I was interested in the SRC's work and the formal governance work and how representatives work. And there, when I was doing that work, I always found that in your language, that there are actually quite a few capabilities missing. And also that the knowledge required in order to be able to successfully navigate a representative mandate for students is overwhelming. And it is basically unachievable within one term. And so I found that perhaps, as an extension of your work, you should, or you could perhaps even encourage somebody else to look into that. So not only into the activist side and how does participation in activism foster certain political capabilities among students, and even beyond that, as you're saying, collective capabilities as well, and but also the formal involvement, the tedious committee work, the work in governance structures, the attempts of impacting the agenda of a Senate or of a council and being able to present that argument, and so on. And so I felt at times when I read certain comments, like, for example, the comment about term limits for SRCs. There's nothing that prohibits an SRC member not to stand for a second term, right? They can just get re-elected. But then I was feeling like, to what extent is there perhaps even knowledge missing there? And I think that is something that one could add. As I said, I kind of agree with Rachel. Perhaps I love the optimism about the university as a transformative space beyond getting a degree. That is already pretty transformative for most people. But of course, you have shown that it can be a politically emancipatory and transformative space as well. I was wondering, because I didn't find a lot of comment on that, whether the university indeed is that progressive space. What is required for it to be that? How can it be perhaps more conducive to the development and formation of political capabilities? And you even now in your presentation briefly called it toxic. So to what extent can it actually be a damaging place? One where it is anti-democratic feelings and anti-democratic sense that is actually being fostered. So that's kind of something that perhaps is a bit less optimistic there. Let me stop here so that we've got enough time as well for Elaine and for some of the comments on the floor. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Thierry, again, for another fantastic set of reflections and questions that I think are going to be very generative for Kura, especially when he thinks about different ways of taking this work forward. I'd now like to call on our third and final discussant. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mika Teko, and really delighted to be part of this discussion and to add my huge congratulations to Kura for the book and for the really clear presentation. And I think in the comments I want to make, I want to bring out more of the quality of the contribution, because I'm wanting to take a very long view of the achievement of this book. I've got in my hand a very old book that was published in 1972, which is like bookends this Kura's book. This is a book called Student Perspectives on South Africa, and it was published by David Phillip, and it contains some really key articles by student leaders at the time, as well as by a number of political scientists and social scientists at the time. And as a young student activist myself in the 1970s, it made a huge impression on me. It has a key chapter by Steve Biko. I think what reading that book side by side with Kura's is you see the extent of his achievement, because the nature of that book is completely silent on the nature of student experience. The issues of the engagement with the form of the university, the issue of students' identity as human beings, their emotional and physical well-being, and the issues of voice and agency, none of that is mentioned. So if you kind of, while this is a really important, this pink book is a really important statement of where analysis of South African student activism lay in the 1970s, it lay focused on big issues of large national student organizations of white and black students, but it failed to take account of the complexity of situation, the complexity of institutional situation, and the complexity of the human beings involved. And I think that's what I consider the enormous achievement of this book, in that with all the academic rigor of very good conceptual analysis and excellently conducted social science research, it's just opened a whole new window on discussion. So very, very big achievements, which I'm so glad that you're able to celebrate today. I think the other achievement, and I know both Rachel and Thierry have raised it, but it is an issue that has come up in studies, different kind of survey studies I've done on the nature of higher education and public good, looking at literature from different countries in Africa. And the work I did with Stephanie Alley and Colleen Howell, Moses Oketch, and Ishmael Oanda, a number of colleagues worked on that project on higher education and the public good in 4 different countries in Africa. And we distinguished between what we called the instrumental and the intrinsic public good aspect of higher education. And I think what your work gives us is a very, very well-grounded conceptually and empirically supported analysis of some of the intrinsic public good aspects of higher education, based, as you observe, on this one campus at this one moment. So those are some of my comments about the appreciation of the achievement and the significance of the study. I wanted to also just raise maybe three or four areas for discussion, and I know some of them you have yourself raised in the conclusion as consider areas for future discussion. The first is around gender, and one of the things that South African higher education and student protest around higher education has raised so signally has been gender-based violence, very toxic cultures around the treatment of women, and very brave activities by a range of women and some men activism in raising these questions. It's a theme I know you acknowledge more needs to be done on, but I would like to hear your reflections of that in relation to this study and some of the issues you bring out. The second theme is around comparison and contrast with other accounts of student activism in South Africa. I'm thinking of Leanne Naidu's work on UCT and other studies that have participant studies that have been written by people who participated in Roseman's. And I think there's really interesting work to be done comparing and contrasting across the differently situated kinds of campuses and the differently situated contexts in which political capabilities are formed. And then the third issue relates to the inward and outward facing scope of the study. And whereas this New Sasaso NAFSA ASB book, this 1972 book, was absolutely silent on the conditions in university and the conditions of students, and addressed political mobilization in quite schematic terms, and that features from all the contributions in a way. I think that there's an underplaying of the connection with the South African setting, that so that while the study is really good on the inward facing dynamics and the looking inward to the higher education space, it's more diffuse and rather general in looking outward. And again, I'd really value your views on that. And then my last reflection is about two thoughts I have about the capability approach and ways of thinking, I think, about conversion factors. And I think it's striking, even when you showed your slides around the conditions of possibility, that both positive and negative conditions of possibility are political parties and social media. And so I think this is a problem in capability approach language. It's not your problem, it's our problem, if you want, in that because there is a focus on making lists of conversion factors, there isn't a language to talk about how they relate to each other and what forms the conditions of possibility, because conditions of possibility are themselves just lists, just like conversion factors are lists. But in fact, what sociological and political and economic analysis allows us to do is group and form the structures, that the formations of those lists. So that's one set of issues of whether you yourself became frustrated with discussing conditions of possibility or conversion factors. Do you think it's got enough analytic purchase on the complexities you're wanting to talk about? And then the last point is about ideas that I'm trying to develop around negative capabilities. And maybe this talks to some of the points Thierry and Rachel have also been raising about what kind of space is higher education. Is it transformative and enabling, as I think your account tries to make it, or is it highly constrained because of the processes of neoliberalism, toxic forms of nationalism, toxic forms of gender politics, misogyny, subject to the powers of the large global tech companies. Those are some of the arguments. And the analysis I've been trying to develop about negative capabilities, that negative, it might represent some kind of broken middle, but it's the only space we have. You know, the higher education might be a very difficult space in which we are, and we are all located in it. We can and we can't say what we want to say. We are reaching out to people who share our vision and ideas, but we're constantly constrained by the formations of competition, technologies, etc., etc. So I found the idea of negative capability very generative in thinking about this kind of broken middle space, and just inviting you or others to think about that. So I'll stop here and hand back to you, Mikateko, and really looking forward to the discussion. And thanks again.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, and thanks once again to all three of our discussants who have given comments on different aspects of the book, how you were thinking about certain ideas conceptually. There's some empirical questions. There are comments about the positive tone of the book, different ways in which you might have been thinking about how certain issues are intertwined in terms of the internal sort of politics happening within the university and how these speak to wider societal issues. So a whole range of questions there for you, Kura. You're, of course, welcome to decide which of these you would like to respond to, and then please leave a little bit of time for us to also take some questions from the audience. I know there are a few questions in the chat that have come up already, and people in the room may like to ask you a few questions, but I'll give you about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for you to respond to any of the questions and responses that have been given by our discussants.
Okay, thank you very much, Mika. And
we just lost sound. We can't hear you anymore. I think you're just muted.
Keep this one on.
Okay.
Go ahead, speak.
Okay, so I was saying thank you very much for the reflections and the comments and the questions. So in my response, I will just select a few questions to respond to. I'll start with Elaine's issue on question on gender. Yes, the issue of gender actually emerged. Students, especially female students, spoke about the issue of gender, and they actually indicated that within activism space itself, we also have got girls being sidelined, their views, their perceptions being sidelined, and then in some cases they would talk of issues to do with meetings and deliberations that would take place maybe at night, and the space itself being unsafe for them, especially when they return to their places of residence or when they go to their homes. So it is something that emerged, but because I just chose not to include it, to pay more attention to it in the book, so that is why it is not clearly spelled out in the book. And then with regards to the issue of comparison study, it is actually something that I'm working on for the next project that I'm currently looking at, and I would like to thank you for the reflections on that one. And then I'll move on to Thierry's comments and reflections as well, when he talks of extension of work on student governance practices. Yes, the current project that I'm currently working on is actually on student on the SRC, and I'll definitely take into consideration your comments and your feedback on that one. And then the idea of the term limit, which emerged as well in the book, what is interesting is that the students, the SRC, they mentioned that the one-year term limit was not enough for them to set long-term goals and also to initiate or to plan long-term initiatives, because they were saying they were not guaranteed of re-election and considering also that the university life is limited to 3 or 4 years. So they were saying they were not guaranteed of re-election, and they were also talking of giving other students who are into activism space for them to initiate activities as well. So for them, they were saying the one-year term limit actually limits their acts as a barrier in their activism activities or in their leadership activities. And then let me move on to Rachel's reflections, which yes, the one that I got, she mentioned the aspect of maybe the life after the students, life after graduating and their participation in activism. Yes, that actually is something that the students mentioned themselves. They mentioned that if I'm to participate in activism activities, I might be arrested. And if I get a criminal record, that would definitely reduce or limits or constrain my chances of getting employment, because I now have got a criminal record. And during the time that I did the interviews, because the interviews were conducted in 2021, I conducted the interviews in 2021. Some of the students that I interviewed, especially those in the SRC, in the Student Representative Governing Body, they actually had a court interdict that inhibited or prohibited them from participating participating or initiating any activism activity. And they were saying, if you look at it, if I'm to participate or if I'm to be part of any gathering, I risk the chance of me being sent to prison or being expelled from the university. So it's also one of those things that the students spoke of. And then I move on to the issue of the focus on campus and society issues. So for the students, for them, they were saying, we come from homes and our parents, they work here within the university space. And so whenever they initiate activism activities, they also had to take into consideration concerns raised by their parents, by the parents or by the student workers. For example, studies also explore the issue of end outsourcing, which is one of the things that students also spoke of. And then let me also just quickly rush and focus on activism and on social media. For the students, for them, social media was valuable in the sense that even though they use it for sharing information, knowing what is happening, and for planning, for logistic purposes as well, for them, they were saying, in case, for example, during the COVID period lockdowns, they were saying if we were not able to utilize or to make use of Twitter to call for hashtag shutdown university, our concerns would not have been addressed by the university. So for them, social media, in as much as it is a toxic space, their view is that it offers them another platform to agitate or to call for transformational change, because they were saying no university wants bad publicity. Their understanding is that the university now, it's a business. So if it's the university is a business, no business wants a negative publicity. So for them to take that hashtag shutdown university online, they are actually saying the university has to address our concerns. The university has to address our grievances. So those are some of the things that I can say in my response to some of the reflections. And then I will take on board all the reflections that you offered in my next project as I continue working on student activism and the expansion of students' political freedoms. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gora. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the comments that are coming through in the chat. So many people congratulating you for fantastic work. There's a question here from Anita saying that she's curious about which years the data was collected. And this is related to how much COVID had an impact on how they were able to do their work and be involved in activism. There's another comment here from Ntimi who says, well done. And then his question is, did you find any forms or typologies of activism, such as rebels and conformists, or neutral activism or activists? So were people being engaged to the same degree or in the same way, or was there some variation in what this activism looked like for people who were involved? I'm not going to read the whole comment or question, but I'm just going to try and sort of skim over some of these. And again, you'll have the choice to decide which ones you respond to. Bagesh also says, congratulations on your book. Could you please reflect on the role of lived experiences in the lives of student activists and how their educational trajectory motivates them to articulate the idea of freedom, values, and opportunities? So if you could give your thoughts on that, that would be great. Also, congratulations from Brownhill Denene, Andrew, Monde, Gabby, and Melanie, of course. So plenty of congratulations to you, and a few questions there that you might like to respond to.
Okay. Right, with regards to the one on rebel activism, anarchy, yes, I can say the students themselves. I did interview one student who told me that, not one, in fact, there were a couple of them, who told me that they were expelled from the university. Some of them had to withdraw because of what they referred to as anarchist activism, and which resulted in them being silenced. And they were mentioning that if you want to engage in anarchist activism, it's only hush in the corridors. Students are not free enough to express or to agitate for change using anarchy ways or in anarchist ways, because we're saying, no, I can't risk expulsion. I can't risk being suspended for 2 years, because where I'm coming from, we are coming from low-income backgrounds, and some of them were first-generation students, and they were saying, for us to engage in anarchy activism, it's too risky, and it also goes to the issue of them thinking of their future employment as well. And then in terms of which year the interviews were conducted, the interviews were conducted in 2021. We also had relaxed lockdown restrictions. So I was able to conduct face-to-face interviews. And for some who were not in Bloemfontein, the interviews were online. And for their activism experience, they were saying, for those who were in Bloemfontein, gathering together as a group was a challenge. But towards the end of the year, they were able to gather and then engage in activism, calling for funds during the extended academic calendar. And for them, social media was actually useful. Is the SRC, for instance, SRC members that I interviewed mentioned that when they were engaging the university for the funds to be released, they actually acknowledged that students were able to initiate an online initiative, and there were 2 different hashtag names, but then they were saying the students are actually complementing the efforts of the SRC, and those things, they came into play, and those the initiative of the students and both the SRC were actually acknowledged by the SRC as forcing, I should not say forcing, but as motivating the university to address the concerns raised by both students. And then the educational trajectory. Yeah, for the students, yes, some of them, they have got experience in activism they had experience in activism from their previous education, lower levels of education. And then some of them also mentioned that by entering the university space, the experiences, what they experienced when they entered the university space. For example, the injustices that they experienced motivated some of them to participate or to engage in activism activities. They were saying, no, when I leave the university space, I wouldn't want my young brother or my young sister to experience what I experienced as I was navigating, or as I was during the course of my studies.
Thanks very much, Kura, for responding to some of those questions. Pedro, I think I saw your hand up and then you put it down, and then I'm just going to check if there are any hands in the room. Anybody has questions? Okay, Fenella, Daisy, and Chris, but I'll go with you first, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon, everyone in the room. Just let me know, Chair, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, lovely. Firstly, I want to congratulate Mikateko on this publication.
Not Mikateko, Kura.
Because I'm missing your laptop.
Oh, I see, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not my publication, it's Kura's.
Oh, it was written Mikateko on the screen, sorry.
I see.
Yeah.
I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Zululand. I will check in the library if the book has arrived, but I did make a request when it came out, I think a month or two ago. So well done on this publication. Now I just want to check with you only two things, and I promise, Chair, I will try to make this comment in 1 minute or two. So universities in South Africa generally, I'm also sure probably also where you come from in Zimbabwe, right across the whole Southern African region, you know. These are products of the settler white colonial project, you know. These are white, racist, and Zionist institutions that have a deep-seated problem of whiteness, you know. And whiteness in South Africa in higher education is not seen as an existential problem. It is rather seen as excellence, you know. And this is why the Fees Must Fall protests happened. And this is why the Fees Must Fall protests will happen again, because the problems that were identified by the Fees Must Fall movement continue to be ignored, you know. And this is not a matter of capability. It's actually a matter of existence, you know. I mean, no human beings can coexist with racism. No human beings can coexist with colonialism, dehumanization, and so on. The minute you colonize is also the same minute the agency to decolonize also begins, you know. So I don't know how far did you engage with the persistent arrogance of whiteness in South African higher education that continues to arrogantly think that it is the owner of knowledge and academic citizenship, and the rest of us are just invited subjects to this white space, you know? So how far have you called out this settler racist university we continue to have? Because I'm sure you might have also experienced some forms of epistemicides when you were writing this book to get approvals for funding, for ethics, and so on, where probably you were being asked to tone down on some aspects or strictly use certain theories that you don't completely believe in. I don't know. You will let us know. So in other words, does your book help us not to have another generation of Black students who will complain about racism and erasure in the university? Or are you simply calling for students to be integrated in these problematic racist institutions, you know? So my question essentially is, who are you writing for? Do you have a problem with the university? Or do you love it the way it is? You know, We just want students to fit into this white system. So
thanks, Pedro. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we've got 3 minutes left, and there were 3 other hands in the room that I'd kind of promised would have a chance. But thank you there for your question on racism, whiteness, how Kura has tackled these issues in his book, and whether his views on the current state of universities is that they're okay as they are, or does he take on a more sort of critical view of the pervasiveness of racism in the higher education system. So we'll take now questions as quickly as possible, please, from Fenella, Daisy, and Chris.
Thanks, Mikitiko. Mine is a quick question. Kura, congratulations on the work and the book and the presentation. We're very proud of you. It's a quick question, and it really just generated from the discussion. I thought the discussant's feedback was fantastic and very giving you a lot of food for thought. And so mine is maybe a quick sort of flighty question as to whether you give, given the comments made about political parties as both conversion factors enabling and constraining, I wondered if you'd given any thought to what the implications are of the government of national unity and what that might have for activists with regard to that factor.
Thank you, Fenella. Daisy?
Thank you so much, Kura. Congratulations. So my question is also brief. I just wanted to find out how you distinguished the capability for voice and the capability for participation, looking at how closely they speak to each other.
Great.
Okay,
Chris.
Thank you. I think my other part, finally, has already addressed the issue around political affiliation. The last aspect I had is around the activism seen as a negative aspect of student engagement in higher education. What's your view on that? Is it all about being negative, or negative in the sense that, like they're saying, if I do this, the university will retaliate, or the university will fight me back? What's your view around that?
May you please come again, please?
Okay, I'm saying viewing activism as a negative aspect of student engagement with the university. Is it all about them saying things that are against the university, or it could be something that they are talking to the university in right terms to make things work for students? Because in most of your narration, I was hearing as if like students, they were saying we're doing this, but we're afraid because the university will do this. So it's more like seeing activism as something that is against or that is negative to the university, if I can put it that fashion.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I come quickly, Prof?
Okay.
See, there's no time.
Yes, there is a time.
I become so irritated every time when people are presenting about studies of this nature. As a former student activist myself, when they're only mentioning Roots Must Fall, and when there were other institutions that played a very influential role during the Fees Must Fall period, it's just that they did not get enough media coverage. I'm talking about institutions like TUT, Shoshanguve campus. Those are anarchists. At Union Building, those are the guys who are on the forefront, of the whole struggle, but they never received, the recognitions and attention that other institutions are getting, like University of Cape Town. Then in expanding your work, please, just try and give, this kind of institutions, some attention. And again, lastly, I enjoyed your presentation, like your study, but I was very concerned that you never mentioned Frantz Fanon, people, in a study of this magnitude. And for me, it's very disturbing because we drew inspiration from, Fanon, people, during that process of, Fees Must Fall, etc.
Thank you. I mean, it seems like we should have calculated for 2 hours instead of 1.5 for this launch. We're out of time, but I want to give you a chance, Kura, to perhaps share sort of concluding reflections and responses to any of the questions that were raised in the previous round, including one more question that I saw in the chat. Do you perhaps now consider yourself an activist scholar? So please wrap things up for us.
Okay, wrapping up, I will consider, I do consider myself as an activist scholar. And okay, Pedro, just to mention, or just to try to, what I can say is the issue of racism, I even included in the book as well. And the students themselves, they understood that they are agents who have to take an active role in the transformational change process. And they have been talking, okay, one of the participants actually presented to me a book that he wrote on that captures, he said that it captures their experiences, it captures what they are going through, and it is part, he says it is going to be part of the ICANN project that they are working on. So it is actually part of the things that the students talk of. And I can say thank you so much for your reflections, which are very important, and I will definitely factor them and include them in my work as I work as an activist scholar. Yes, yeah. And I recall one instance where one student told me, actually scolded me, said, "You are a researcher and here you are. We know that you definitely sugarcoat what we are telling you, and we don't expect you to sugarcoat what we are telling you. We expect you to represent us, and we expect you to write what we are telling you as it is without changing or altering anything." Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kura, and thank you to our discussants. Some of the keywords or reflections that stood out to me is that everybody who read the book for the purposes of this launch enjoyed reading the book. They mentioned that it was thought-provoking, that it opened a new window of discussion, and that you really share some fresh and exciting perspectives in the book. So once again, a huge congratulations to you, Kura, on this fantastic achievement. And it really does sound like your book is worth reading. And thank you so much again to our discussants for their fantastic feedback and reflections, which Kura plans to engage with in his work going forward. So that brings us to the end of this launch. Thank you also to everybody who's been sharing their congratulations in the chat. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you, Mika. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, Lane. Bye, Thierry. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.